Hello and welcome. These audio recordings are designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam, and we'll go over some of the more common Part C questions found on Paper 1. You may find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, or you might just want to listen through as part of your revision. That's okay too. Today, we will be looking at a question which arrives on the paper very regularly. Many of you will be familiar with what us history teachers call the PEE technique. That is to say, in each paragraph you make a point, back it up with evidence in the form of names, dates, statistics, quotations, people, places and events, and then explain it by using phrases such as "this shows" or "this suggests." Better answers will often give more than one layer of explanation or analysis, and we call this PEE 2.0 because you're doing it twice. So in this response, we will use the PEE formula. So let's get started. Today's question is, who is to blame for the start of the Cold War? Now, before we begin properly, just bear in mind that the question won't appear in this exact format on your 10-mark Part C Paper 1 question. Instead, you'll be given a statement and asked to answer the question, how far do you agree with this? So this question could come up in the form of, Stalin was to blame for the start of the Cold War, how far do you agree? Or, Truman was to blame for the start of the Cold War, how far do you agree? But in order to be thorough and cover all bases, this question will stick to the generic who is to blame for the start of the Cold War and hope that you can then place this information directly to answer the question set. Okay, let's get going. Who is to blame for the start of the Cold War? This answer will, as all Part C answers should, give two sides of the argument. We will use a 4-4 split. That is to say, we'll give 4 PEs to suggest one half of the argument. We'll then use the magic words "on the other hand," and we'll then give 4 PEs to suggest the other half of the argument. So, the first part, we will argue that Russia is to blame. Point 1. Russia took over Eastern Europe after World War II, despite Poland being an Allied subject of disagreement at Yalta and Potsdam, and agreement being made over free elections. Evidence to support this includes Cominform was set up in 1947 to promote international revolution. Moreover, in March 1948, Czechoslovakia turned communist and the pro-American politician Jan Masaryk was killed. Spies and police states became the norm in Soviet satellite states or puppet governments in places such as Finland, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Albania and Bulgaria, within just 9 months of the end of World War II. And so in explaining this point, we could argue that Russian actions immediately after World War II in Eastern Europe heightened the tensions and started the Cold War. Point 2. Stalin's personality. Evidence to support this include, well, Stalin never trusted the West, even during World War II when they were allies. The Yugoslav Miroslav Žilas reported that Stalin had once said, quote, "Churchill is the kind of man who would pick your pocket for a kopeck, but Roosevelt is not like that. He dips in his hand only for bigger coins," unquote. So Stalin was an increasingly paranoid and distrusting dictator who never trusted the West. And in explaining this point, you could certainly argue that this was a cause of friction at the start of the Cold War. Point 3. The Berlin blockade. Evidence to support this point includes: the Berlin blockade began in June 1948 and the airlift lasted 10 months. It was Stalin who began the blockade. 2 million West Berliners were cut off, and the blockade finished in May 1949, the same month that West Germany came into being. American President Truman had said in 1949 that it was a test of, quote, our will to resist, unquote. NATO was set up in 1949 during this in Washington, and Article 3 confirmed that an attack against one was to be regarded as an attack against all. The Warsaw Pact then followed in 1955, and the East German state was declared in October 1949, and so it could be argued, in explaining this point, that Stalin began the Berlin blockade, and it was this that led to the formation of blocs in Europe and America, and thus that Stalin was to blame for the start of the Cold War. Point 4. Communist ideology declared conflict inevitable. Evidence to support this point includes: Karl Marx had written the Communist Manifesto in 1848 and Das Kapital in 1861, in which he spoke of iron laws in his theory of dialectical materialism. Marx was writing that revolution was inevitable and that international conflagration was certain. He argued that the lumpen proletariat would be ruled by a dictatorship of the proletariat following a short period in which it would wither away. The Long Telegram, written by George Kennan in February 1946, greatly influenced American views over communist expansion, and so again, in explaining this point, we could argue that it was communist ideology and its threat of world domination that began tensions at the start of the Cold War. Okay, time for the magic words. On the other hand. We'll now go on to explore how we could blame the West. Starting with point 1. The West failed to help their Russian allies and to open up a second Eastern Front during World War II. Evidence to support this includes: 300,000 British and 297,000 American soldiers died in World War II, but this figure pales into insignificance compared to the 20 million Russians who died. Moreover, Churchill had ordered that German weapons were not to be destroyed at the end of World War II in case they had to be used against the liberating Russians. And so this evidence suggests that the Allies didn't trust Russia even when they were friends during World War II, and thus that maybe the West is to blame for some of the early friction that helped the onset of the Cold War. Point 2. Broken promises over a free hand in Eastern Europe between Yalta to Potsdam, February to July 1945. Evidence to support this claim is that it had been agreed that Eastern Europe would be a Soviet sphere of influence, although what this meant was not technically clear. The advent of American atomic diplomacy with the Manhattan Project, and also the change in American presidents from FDR to Truman, more of a hardliner, affected this greatly. And so in explaining this point, we could argue that the West broke promises, in parenthesis, over a free hand in Eastern Europe, and that this would have created distrust in Stalin, and thus is evidence that the West is to blame for the start of the Cold War. Point 3. Truman and Churchill were hardline anti-communists. This links nicely to point 2, and evidence to support this includes: Truman had taken over after FDR's death on the 12th of April 1945. Truman famously said the only language the Russians understood was, quote, "How many divisions have you got?" unquote. The Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment suggested an anti-communist foreign policy, and Marshall Aid, whereby $17 billion were offered over 4 years to support vulnerable European nations such as Greece, could be seen as economic hegemony and a provocative act by the West, even though it was against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Churchill was also a hardliner. But once he was voted out of office in July 1945 and replaced by Clement Attlee, this meant that there was less mediation between Stalin and Truman. Churchill said after the Yalta Conference that the Soviets were, quote, "a danger to the free world," unquote, in private in 1945. And, more famously, in his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, Churchill claimed, quote, "From Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended," unquote. And so this kind of speech and rhetoric could be seen, when explaining your point, to suggest that Truman and Churchill, being hardline anti-communists, were to blame for the start of the Cold War. Finally, point 4. America had an atomic monopoly until 1949. Evidence to support this includes: American atomic strength was tested in a US desert site on the 16th of July 1945, following completion of Robert J. Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project. Harry Truman was the man who made the decision to drop not 1 but 2 atomic bombs on Japanese citizens at Hiroshima on the 6th of the 8th 45, killing 70,000 people, including civilians, and then on Nagasaki on the 9th of the 8th 45. Of the bomb, Churchill said, quote, "The bomb brought peace," unquote. And so, we have argued that on the one hand, Russia is to blame because Russia took over Eastern Europe post-World War II, Stalin distrusted his Western allies, Stalin began the Berlin blockade, and communist ideology declared conflict inevitable. But on the other hand, we have argued that the West could be seen to be to blame because they failed to open a second Eastern Front in World War II to help Russia. They broke promises, in parenthesis, between Yalta and Potsdam. Truman and Churchill were hardline anti-communists. And finally, America had an atomic monopoly until 1949. So, now it's time for our clever conclusion. Both sides were accountable depending upon who you ask, especially if they are Russian or American historians writing during the Cold War era. This argument, however, believes that a greater degree of blame goes on the West because it was they who formalised the conflict first. For example, NATO came about before the Warsaw Pact, West Germany came about before East Germany, and the USA had the atomic bomb before the USSR. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. If you did, feel free to follow me on Twitter @Mr. Guiney History, or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye!